The surveyor's red flag in the dirt froze everyone in place. Karen stood smugly with folded arms, insisting the backyard she'd never set foot in was legally hers. Neighbors gasped, whispering as the line cut right through a flower bed I had planted 10 years ago. But what Karen didn't know was that I had something buried deeper than the roots, something that would unravel her entire claim. For years, Daniel and his wife Emily had lived peacefully in their modest suburban home. The backyard was Daniel's sanctuary, filled with rose bushes, a small vegetable patch, and an old oak tree that shaded their patio in the summer. It wasn't extravagant, but it was his. That peace shattered one sunny Saturday morning when Karen, the infamous HOA president, marched over with 2 board members trailing her like guards. She waved a stack of papers and announced, "Daniel, you've been trespassing on HOA managed land for years. This entire section of your backyard belongs to the association. Effective immediately, you are required to vacate and restore it." Daniel laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke, but Karen wasn't smiling. Her papers looked official, stamped with HOA letterheads and signed by a notary. She even had highlighted lines suggesting the common property line extended 20 feet into his backyard. The neighbors gathered, sensing drama. Whispers filled the air. Some looked sympathetic, others intrigued, secretly entertained by the chaos Karen always seemed to stir. Emily, clutching her gardening gloves, whispered to Daniel, "This can't be real." "Right, we've lived here for 12 years, that's our yard." But Karen pressed on. "You've enjoyed HOA property all this time without permission. That oak tree, it's on our land, the fence, illegally placed, and those flower beds, consider them vandalism. You'll be fined daily until the encroachment is corrected." The words landed like a punch. Daniel felt anger boiling, but kept his composure. He knew Karen's reputation: manipulative, entitled, always twisting rules to her advantage. But this was war. Instead of arguing, he calmly replied, "Karen, I'll look into this. Don't think for a second I'll hand over my yard without a fight." That night, Daniel stayed up combing through old records. He found property deeds, closing documents, and surveys from when he first bought the home. They clearly marked the backyard as his. But there was something else too, something he had almost forgotten. In a dusty box tucked away in the attic was an envelope sealed by the county registrar. Inside were underground records, old property archives from before the HOA even existed. Records so old they were handwritten, yet officially stamped. They showed not only that his land extended beyond Karen's claim, but also that a legal easement existed under that oak tree. Daniel's heart raced. He realized Karen's evidence might not just be wrong, it might be fabricated, but before he could celebrate, his phone buzzed with a new HOA email. Subject: final notice of trespass backyard claim. Karen wasn't waiting. She was escalating, and as Daniel stared at the glowing screen, one thought consumed him. If she's willing to go this far, what will she do when I reveal the truth buried beneath my backyard? But what Karen did at the next HOA meeting would send shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. Subscribe now, because you won't believe what happens when neighbors take things too far. The HOA meeting was supposed to be routine. But when Karen slammed down a map of the neighborhood, accusing me of land theft, the entire room erupted. Gasps echoed as her finger traced a red marker line that conveniently shifted the property boundary in her favor. But the moment I stood up with my own evidence, records older than the HOA itself, her smile faltered. And what happened next turned the meeting into a courtroom. That Tuesday evening, the community center was packed tighter than usual. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as neighbors shuffled in, some out of boredom, others out of curiosity. Karen thrived on these spectacles. Perched at the front of the room behind a long table draped with HOA banner, she wore her signature smug expression. Beside her sat 2 board members, clearly nervous. while a notary and a man in a crisp suit, whom Karen introduced as her legal consultant, loomed at her side. Emily squeezed Daniel's hand before the meeting began. "Stay calm. Don't let her bait you." Karen banged the gavel. "Order. Tonight's first and most urgent issue, the encroachment of HOA land by resident Daniel Hart. For years, he has unlawfully claimed and altered association property, and it is time we take decisive action." The audience murmured. Some neighbors nodded, others frowned. One even whispered, "Here we go again." Karen unfurled a large laminated map, dramatically spreading it across the table. A thick red line ran straight through Daniel's yard, swallowing his oak tree and vegetable garden into association property. "Here is the official survey," Karen declared, tapping the map. "It proves beyond doubt that Mr. Hart's fence, his tree, and even his shed are on HOA land. This is theft, plain and simple. The board will be voting tonight on immediate enforcement and fines." A hush fell. Daniel felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. He stood slowly, adjusting the folder in his hands. "With all due respect, Karen, that is not the truth. What you've shown here isn't an official county survey. It's a copy one that's been altered." Karen's lips curled. "Are you accusing the HOA of fraud?" Daniel didn't flinch. He opened his folder and pulled out his first piece of evidence, the original closing survey from 12 years ago, stamped by the county registrar. The lines were clear. His yard was fully within his property. "This is the official survey from the day I bought my home. And I have the deed to match. Every document from the county proves this yard is mine." Gasps spread across the room. Karen snatched the survey from his hand, scanning it, her face tightening, but Daniel wasn't done. He reached back into his folder and pulled out the envelope, the underground records. He laid the fragile papers carefully on the table for everyone to see. "These are archival property records from before the HOA was even formed. They show not only that my land extends beyond the current fence line, but also that a legal easement was granted for utilities under the oak tree. That means the association has no authority here. In fact, Karen," he paused for effect, locking eyes with her, "your so-called evidence directly contradicts legally binding county records." The room buzzed. Neighbors leaned forward, snapping pictures with their phones. One man whispered, "If that's true, she's cooked." Karen's face flushed red. She slammed her hand on the table. "This is irrelevant. These records are ancient, outdated." Daniel cut in, his voice rising. "County property records don't expire. What does expire, Karen, is your credibility." The legal consultant at her side shuffled uncomfortably. He leaned toward her and whispered something, but she waved him off, panic flashing in her eyes. From the back, an older neighbor named Mrs. Dalton spoke up. "Karen, I remember when this neighborhood was built. Daniel's yard has always been his. You're twisting the rules again." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Emily stood beside her husband now, her voice firm but calm. "This isn't about property. It's about power, and everyone in this room knows it." Karen's composure cracked. She gripped the gavel, pounding it on the table. "Enough. The board will deliberate privately. Until then, Mr. Hart, you are still in violation." But as she tried to shut the meeting down, Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was an email notification from the county property office. The subject line read, "Verification of historic records, immediate attention." Daniel's pulse quickened. The timing was too perfect. Someone at the county had just confirmed his underground records. He looked back at Karen, her face pale now, the first cracks of fear showing, and in that tense silence the neighborhood realized something shocking. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control, but the battle was far from over, because the very next morning, Daniel would discover a set of anonymous complaints filed against him, and the truth behind them would expose just how far Karen was willing to go. The HOA meeting ended in chaos, but Karen wasn't finished. By the following morning, Daniel received an official, looking notice shoved under his front door. In bold letters, it read, "Notice of illegal occupation. Immediate action required." Emily gasped when she saw it. Illegal occupation. "Daniel, they're making it sound like we're squatters on our own land." Daniel scanned the paper carefully. The wording was aggressive fines, penalties, even threats of legal eviction from the disputed area. But something stood out. The letter was signed HOA Compliance Division. Except Daniel knew the HOA had no such division. It was just Karen and her board of sycophants. "She's bluffing again," Daniel muttered, tossing the notice onto the counter. But this time she slipped. Still, Karen wasn't only relying on paperwork. That afternoon, a loud clanging echoed from the backyard. Daniel rushed outside to find Karen's contractors, two men in reflective vests, hammering a fresh wooden stake into the grass right where his flower bed began. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Daniel demanded. One of the men avoided eye contact. "We were told this is HOA land. We're here to mark the boundary for removal." "By who?" Daniel pressed. The man hesitated before mumbling. "Karen." Karen herself appeared seconds later, smug as ever, holding her phone like it was a gavel. "You're trespassing, Daniel. These men are marking HOA ground so we can clear your illegal encroachments. You can fight me in court if you want, but every day you delay will cost you fines." Emily, trembling with fury, snapped back. "You can't just show up and take someone's yard. This is harassment." Karen smirked. "No, dear. This is compliance." Daniel clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't give Karen the satisfaction of exploding in front of the neighbors, who were once again gathering along the fences like it was prime time entertainment. Instead, he stepped closer and said quietly, "Karen, if you don't leave right now, you'll regret what happens next." Her eyes narrowed. She was used to people caving under her pressure, not standing tall. Empty threats won't save you. But Daniel wasn't bluffing. That evening, he drove straight to the county records office with the envelope of underground documents in hand. The clerk, an older man with glasses, carefully examined them. His eyebrows shot up. "These are official." "And rare," the clerk said. "See this stamp? That's from the county registrar back in the 1960s. Pre-HOA, untouchable. And this easement clause here, it protects your oak tree and extends your land rights 5 feet further than even your deed shows. If the HOA challenges this in court, they'll lose badly." Daniel felt relief flood his chest, but it was mixed with anger. Karen had knowingly fabricated evidence and trespassed with contractors. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a setup. When he got home, Emily was pacing. "Karen was back while you were gone. She told the neighbors she has proof we forged our deed. People are starting to believe her, Daniel. She's poisoning the whole street against us." Daniel set the envelope on the table. "Then it's time to turn the tables. If Karen wants to play dirty, she's about to find out how deep my records go." The next morning, Daniel sent a registered letter to Karen and the entire HOA board. Attached were certified copies of the underground records, highlighted clauses showing his ownership, and a blunt message: "Any further trespassing or harassment will be met with legal action. Consider this your..." Final warning, neighbors whispered as the letter circulated. Some were stunned. Others quietly applauded. For the first time, Karen's iron grip on the HOA seemed to crack. But instead of backing down, Karen doubled down. 2 days later, Daniel opened his blinds to a sight that froze his blood. A bright orange notice of demolition, sign nailed to his oak tree, and standing beside it, phone in hand, was Karen, smiling. "This tree comes down tomorrow," she said loudly enough for half the block to hear. "It's on our land and I've scheduled removal." "Try and stop it, Daniel." Daniel's jaw tightened. She had just crossed the line, because what Karen didn't know was that cutting down that oak tree wasn't just an act of destruction, it was a violation of state-protected easement law. A violation that could not only bankrupt her HOA, but expose her entire scam to public record, and Daniel was ready to let her walk right into the trap. But when the demolition crew arrived, What Daniel did next made the whole neighborhood realize Karen had finally messed with the wrong man. The tension in the neighborhood was reaching its breaking point. Whispers and curious glances followed the protagonist everywhere he went. Karen had spun her story so thoroughly that some neighbors genuinely believed he was a manipulative schemer who had built his backyard illegally. Others, however, quietly offered support, telling him to hold strong. But it was the thick white envelope that landed in his mailbox one late afternoon that shifted the entire battle. The HOA had sent an official note, signed by Karen herself as president of the board, stating that unless he returned the yard to its rightful dimensions, the association would begin fining him daily. The fines weren't small, they stacked up quickly, threatening to drain him financially if he didn't comply. He sat on his porch, holding the letter with trembling hands. His dog sat quietly at his feet, sensing his distress. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard Karen claimed wasn't his. A mix of fury and helplessness surged inside him. How could she get away with this? How could a single neighbor's entitlement twist into a weapon that threatened his home and peace? That night, he spread the letter on his kitchen table, lit only by the dim overhead light. He read every line over and over again, searching for flaws, loopholes, anything that could prove her overreach. And then a detail caught his eye, an almost careless error. Karen had cited the wrong section of the HOA bylaws. The fine she referenced applied only to unauthorized external construction projects, not to property boundary disputes. His pulse quickened. It was a mistake, but a powerful one. A mistake that might just unravel everything she had built against him. The next morning, he walked into the HOA administrative office with the letter in hand. The clerk, a tired-looking woman who had clearly seen her fair share of HOA drama, raised her eyebrows when she read it. She cited the wrong section. The clerk murmured, "That shouldn't have gone out like this." But before she could say more, Karen stormed into the office, her heels clacking like a gavel striking judgment. Her eyes locked onto him. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, voice sharp enough to cut through steel. He calmly held up the letter. "I'm here because you made a mistake, Karen. This notice isn't valid." The clerk shifted uncomfortably as Karen's face flushed crimson. For a moment, she looked like she might scream. Instead, she forced a tight smile, though her eyes were blazing. "We'll see about that," she snapped, snatching the letter back. But even as she left, he could see it, doubt flickering in her expression. He had struck a nerve. Later that week, something even more shocking happened. A neighbor named Mr. Dalton, who had lived in the community for decades, approached him quietly. "I've been watching this whole mess," Dalton said in a low voice, "and I think you should know something. Karen hasn't always been truthful about the HOA. There's more going on than you realize." The protagonist leaned in, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Dalton hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Let's just say, Karen has used her position to bend the rules before. If you dig deep enough, you'll find records that don't line up. I suggest you check the HOA archives, but be careful. If she finds out, she won't play nice." That night, the protagonist sat in silence, Dalton's words echoing in his head. He thought about the mistake in the letter, the whisper of something bigger hiding in the HOA records, the possibility that Karen's power wasn't as unshakable as she pretended. For the first time in weeks, hope sparked inside him. Maybe he wasn't just defending his backyard anymore. Maybe he was uncovering something much larger. But what he didn't know was that Karen had already anticipated his next move. And she was preparing something ruthless to stop him. Because when he opened his mailbox the next morning, there wasn't just another letter. There was a certified legal notice. And this time, the words on the page would leave him absolutely speechless. The courthouse that morning buzzed with the muted hum of whispered speculation. Neighbors from Willow Creek had shown up in small groups, some curious, others eager for drama. For months, Karen had strutted around claiming ownership of a piece of Daniel's backyard, telling anyone who would listen that the HOA had her back, and that Daniel was just a squatter on borrowed land. Now, the truth was about to be tested in a courtroom. The courthouse that morning buzzed with the muted hum of whispered speculation. Neighbors from Willow Creek had shown up in small groups, some curious, others eager for drama. For months, Karen had strutted around claiming ownership of a piece of Daniel's backyard, telling anyone who would listen that the HOA had her back, and that Daniel was just a squatter on borrowed land. Now, the truth was about to be tested in a courtroom. Daniel sat calmly on the wooden bench, his documents neatly arranged in a leather folder. He wore the same expression he'd carried since this ordeal began, stoic, quiet, but deeply determined. He wasn't just fighting for his backyard. He was fighting for his dignity, his right to peace, and the principle that bullies like Karen shouldn't be allowed to twist the truth for their gain. Across the aisle, Karen entered the courtroom as though she were stepping onto a stage. She wore a bold red blazer and oversized sunglasses that she refused to remove, her lips twisted in a self-satisfied smirk. Behind her trailed two HOA board members, equally smug, whispering to each other as if victory was guaranteed. Karen clutched a thin binder, her evidence, and tapped it loudly on the desk as she sat down, making sure everyone noticed. The bailiff called the court to order, and soon the judge, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, entered the room. His gavel struck wood and silence fell. Case of Willow Creek HOA versus Mr. Daniel Hart. The clerk read aloud. Karen immediately raised her hand, interrupting before she was asked to speak. Your Honor. She began with a voice dripping in false sweetness. This man has been encroaching on property that rightfully belongs to the HOA, and, by extension, me. He has disregarded repeated warnings and caused distress to the entire neighborhood. Daniel didn't flinch. He kept his gaze on the judge, waiting for his turn. The judge lifted a brow. You'll have your opportunity to present your case, ma'am. Let's proceed in order. Karen sat back with an exaggerated sigh, crossing her arms dramatically. The HOA attorney stood and began to outline their claims. Daniel's fence had supposedly crossed the property line, swallowing up land maintained under HOA jurisdiction. They even produced photographs, carefully angled to make it look like Daniel's backyard extended further than it should. Each time the lawyer presented a photo, Karen leaned forward and whispered loudly, "See, proof." But when Daniel's attorney rose, the room's energy shifted. Calmly, methodically, he began placing document after document on the table before the judge. Certified land surveys, county maps dating back decades, even the original plat of Willow Creek subdivision, highlighting the underground utilities and easement lines. This, Daniel's lawyer explained, pointing to a highlighted section, is Mr. Hart's lot. The HOA claims ownership of this shaded area, but as this county certified survey shows, it has always been part of Mr. Hart's deed. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Several neighbors leaned forward, recognizing the very ground they had walked on during barbecues at Daniel's house. Karen's face twitched, but she quickly masked it with a haughty chuckle. "Oh, please," she said loudly. "Those papers don't mean anything. The HOA board voted, and that makes it binding." The judge's eyes narrowed. "The HOA cannot override recorded county land deeds, ma'am. The law is clear." Karen froze. For the first time, her confidence seemed to waver. The color drained from her face, but Daniel wasn't finished. With deliberate precision, he pulled out one last envelope. Inside was a letter stamped and signed by the county registrar's office, confirming his ownership. It referenced underground sewer access points that could only exist if the property line matched his deed. The judge studied the letter silently for several long moments. The tension in the room thickened. Karen shuffled in her seat, glancing nervously at the HOA members behind her. The silence was deafening. Finally, the judge placed the paper down, removed his glasses, and looked directly at Karen. His expression was unreadable, stern, but also heavy, as though he'd seen too many cases like this before. "You've made serious allegations against your neighbor, Mrs. Kensington," he said quietly, "but this letter, along with these certified records..." He trailed off, tapping the documents with his finger. They appeared to tell a very different story. The room collectively held its breath. Karen's eyes darted wildly between the judge and Daniel, desperate for some way to claw back control. And then the judge leaned back in his chair, pausing before delivering the next words. Unless you have irrefutable proof to counter these official records, this court may be forced to conclude. He stopped mid-sentence, his gavel hovering above the block. A bailiff entered suddenly, walking quickly to the judge's bench with a sealed envelope. The judge opened it, read silently, and his expression darkened. The neighbors leaned forward, whispers erupting across the room. Karen's lips curled into a sly smile again, as if she knew something the others didn't. Daniel, however, sat perfectly still, gripping his folder tightly, because whatever was in that envelope had just changed everything. But the revelation inside that envelope would leave Daniel, and the entire neighborhood, staring in stunned silence. By the time the weekend rolled around, the entire community was buzzing. Everyone had seen Karen's outburst in the meeting, her shouting match with David, and her stormy exit. But what no one expected was how quickly the tide of opinion would turn against her. At first, Karen had tried to spin the narrative. She went door-to-door, knocking on her neighbors' homes with a clipboard in hand. David is a liar, she declared to one couple as they stood awkwardly on their porch. He forged documents, he's making a mockery of the HOA, and if we let him win, none of our property values will be safe. The couple exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably. But Karen, the husband said gently, we saw the meeting. He had records from the county. They looked official. Karen's face stiffened, her forced smile breaking into something colder. Those were fake. You think I don't know what's real and what isn't. He's manipulating everyone, and you. She pointed an accusing finger. You're falling for it. But her tactics weren't working. More and more, neighbors began to close their doors politely, choosing not to engage. Others whispered among themselves, clearly doubting her story. A few even came by David's house to apologize for not speaking up sooner. David, though still weary from the conflict, felt a small sense of vindication. He hadn't wanted this fight, but seeing the community finally start to recognize Karen's behavior was like a weight lifting off his shoulders. Still, he remained cautious. Karen wasn't one to back down quietly, and sure enough, on Sunday morning, the entire street awoke to a shocking sight. Someone, though everyone knew who, had plastered dozens of printed flyers on every mailbox and lamppost in the neighborhood. In bold, red letters they read, "Warning, David is a fraud. He's trying to steal land that isn't his. Don't trust him." Below the headline was a grainy, poorly cropped picture of David's backyard, circled with arrows and captions accusing him of trespassing. The neighborhood buzzed with fresh tension. Parents pulled their children closer as they passed his home. A few neighbors shook their heads at the absurdity. Others looked uneasy, clearly unsure of what to believe anymore. When David saw the flyer taped to his own mailbox, he clenched his jaw. He wasn't an angry man by nature, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. Karen was trying to poison the whole community against him. That night, David sat in his living room staring at the stack of county documents spread across the coffee table. He could fight Karen legally. He knew he had the proof. But deep down, he wondered, was this even about land anymore? Or was it about pride, control, and the fact that Karen couldn't stand being proven wrong? The following morning, as he stepped outside to collect his newspaper, David froze. There was Karen, standing proudly in the middle of the street with her arms crossed. And around her, nearly a dozen neighbors had gathered, their expressions ranging from curious to outright concerned. Karen's voice rang out across the cul-de-sac. Neighbors, today we put an end to this nonsense once and for all. David is a liar, and I have the proof. Tonight, I'll show you all exactly why this backyard isn't his. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People looked from Karen to David, waiting to see how he would respond. David's heart pounded. He hadn't expected this. Karen staging a neighborhood rally against him. But what Karen didn't know was that David had uncovered something in the underground records that she would never be able to explain away. And when he revealed it, the entire neighborhood would see her in a completely different light. But how he chose to reveal it would decide whether the community stood united behind him, or whether the HOA would descend into complete chaos. The morning of the hearing arrived, and tension rippled across the entire neighborhood. The community center, usually quiet with small meetings about landscaping and garbage pickup, was packed to the brim. Neighbors filled every seat, murmuring about what would finally unfold. Some whispered in Karen's defense, clinging to her constant narrative of being the protector of property values, while others leaned toward the protagonist, whose quiet strength and mounting evidence had shifted the tide. Karen walked in first, dressed like she was heading to a courtroom drama, a pressed blazer, sharp heels clicking against the floor, and an air of superiority radiating off her. She smirked at the crowd, then turned her gaze to the protagonist, who entered moments later with a calm expression, carrying a single black folder, the one that held the underground records no one could argue against. The HOA board members sat stiffly at the front, clearly dreading what was about to happen. They had allowed Karen too much influence for too long, and now the entire community was here to watch the fallout. Karen launched into her accusations first, her voice sharp and animated. "This man has encroached on community property. His so-called backyard is technically HOA-owned land, and therefore it belongs under HOA authority. He has violated rules, ignored warnings, and disrespected the community." Murmurs spread. Some nodded, others frowned. Then it was the protagonist's turn. He stood, slow and steady, and opened his folder. The room fell silent. "Everything you've just heard," he began, his voice low but commanding, "is false. My family has lived here for years, peacefully, and yet, for months, I've been harassed, intimidated, and accused of stealing something that isn't even up for debate. Because the truth isn't buried in opinion, it's buried in records." He spread out a series of documents on the table for the board and audience to see. Old land surveys, signed and notarized. Legal descriptions that matched perfectly with his property line. And finally, the underground utility maps, the undeniable proof that the disputed backyard space was tied directly to his home's deed, stretching decades back. Karen's face drained of color. She shifted uncomfortably, but before she could speak, the protagonist delivered the finishing blow. "And if anyone still doubts this," he said, sliding forward one last piece of paper, "here's the county's official record from 30 years ago. The HOA map, the one Karen has waved around at every meeting, was never updated after construction changes. The truth was buried underground, literally." Gasps filled the room. People leaned forward to see the highlighted diagrams, the signatures, the seals. Karen stood frozen, her mouth opening but no words coming out. The board members looked at each other, shame written across their faces. One of them cleared his throat. "It appears," he said cautiously, "that this matter has been misinterpreted. The records confirm that the backyard is indeed private property, belonging to the homeowner. We apologize for the oversight." The crowd erupted. Some clapped, others shook their heads in disbelief at Karen. The spell she had held over the neighborhood for years was broken in an instant. Karen tried one last desperate tactic. "This is a mistake. You're all being misled," she shrieked, her voice echoing across the hall. But the audience wasn't with her anymore. People began booing, shaking their heads and muttering under their breath. For the first time, Karen stood truly alone. The protagonist didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or throw insults. He simply closed his folder, looked around the room, and said calmly, "All I ever wanted was peace in my own home. I hope, from now on, we can all respect each other as neighbors." The board adjourned the meeting, embarrassed but relieved. Neighbors approached the protagonist, some apologizing for doubting him, others offering warm congratulations. His calm perseverance had turned the tide, not just in his favor, but for the entire community. As Karen stormed out of the building, heels clicking furiously, The neighborhood knew things would never be the same again. Her reign of intimidation had crumbled. Back at home, as the protagonist sat quietly in his reclaimed backyard, watching the sun dip behind the trees, he reflected on the battle that had consumed so many months of his life. He had faced lies, manipulation, and a wall of resistance. But truth had prevailed. And though Karen might try again someday, he knew the neighborhood had finally seen her for what she was. The underground records hadn't just cleared his name. They had uncovered the truth buried beneath years of HOA politics and fear. And now, real peace, was possible again, but just as he closed his eyes, taking in the calm, a thought flickered in his mind. What if Karen wasn't done yet? Because in neighborhoods like this, the battle was never truly over. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because the next twist in HOA drama is always around the corner, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.